Hi folks, I thought I would change it up tonight, change the view, and change the format of this video, and do a reaction video. And it will be about a topic in politics. Now, don't get me wrong, politics tends to be a zero-sum game. You're going to offend as many people as you probably glom onto when it comes to these topics. But for those who've already picked a side, politics is just bread and butter anyway, so it was an inevitability. But I will try to keep political videos or videos about political topics to a minimum, probably once a week, if even less. I tend to watch YouTube on a daily basis, and the algorithm serves up a lot of videos, and one of those videos just caught my eye, and it was about, it was from this guy, Canadian, middle-aged, have a salt and pepper ear. He's basically Jordan Peterson if you ordered him from Wish. So, yeah, just a third-rate Jordan Peterson, I guess you could say, but he doesn't have the Kermit the Frog accent, so he's got that going for him. And it is a recently made channel, made in middle of 2020. So the age is pretty young in terms of YouTube channels. But it's older than mine, so most of his videos have a couple hundred views, but this latest video has kind of blown up. It's, as of this recording, I've gotten at least 14,000 views. And I watched through it previously just to get a sense of what he's going off of. But I didn't agree with everything that he said. He made some points that were fair, but other points, he failed to back them up. And so, without further ado, let's actually see what I'm talking about here.
People appear to have less and less understanding about the intellectual arguments behind some of the most controversial movements in the political and social landscape. In spite of a logical or even unified narrative, people nonetheless go along with the overall momentum of modern social movements.
Okay, people. Who are these people?
The assumption appears to be that since the media and progressive activists...
The media, progressive activists. Who's this media, and who are these progressive activists? You didn't name any names?
Basically on the side of anti-racism, social justice, diversity, freedom, and feminism, we should give them our wholehearted support, even if what they say is a little belligerent at times.
Belligerent. I like the use of the word belligerent. It's very, very aggressive.
All of these are noble causes, of course, but the hypocrisy is ubiquitous in all of them. In this episode, we're going to take a look at some of these contradictions. If you think these conversations are as fun as I do, hit those like and subscribe buttons. My name is Kris, and this is The Think Report.
The Think Report. Got these high-level ideas.
That we need to support a movement simply because their intention is good is a dangerous assumption.
Okay, yeah. I mean, his point is pretty fair on its face. But he's ascribing a whole lot of values to something without even like backing up like who is saying these things.
We need to be brave enough to say no when things stop making sense. In some of the most famous cases, movements that start out fighting for justice end up as some sort of tyranny. The most famous case being Hitler and the Nazis.
Oh yeah. Can't have a political video without mentioning Hitler and the Nazis.
Of course, the party's full name in English is National Socialist German Workers' Party.
Yes, that's true. Although socialist in those days didn't mean the socialist that you hear bandied about in this day and age. Context is everything.
Nazi is short for its German name. Germans were struggling after World War I, and with the growing gap between the rich and the poor, the Nazi Party stepped in as a socialist movement.
Yeah, like again, socialism in Germany during that time was very different than socialism of today.
Progressive ideas to save the lower and middle class. Of course, they ended up as right-wing fascists, but they started as left-wing progressives. Back to modern-day movements. Many of them have good intentions, but if they genuinely care about justice for everybody, including the most marginalized, they do well to read up on some of them. Unfortunately, the media convolutes most things for us. Controversial articles...
The media, here's that term again, the media.
Media publishers the most money. Outrage is quite literally the currency of internet, and truth no longer matters.
Okay, so truth no longer matters. Rage is the currency of the internet. So the rage is the currency of the internet. I do agree with his point. I think media profits off of division and rage. So that point, I do agree with. The other point about truth, well, depends on your definition of truth, like whose truth.
As a result, we've become deeply and desperately confused about how to make sense of these topics with a cobbled together narrative rife with contradictions. One of my favorite contradictions is one that commentator Matt Walsh points out.
Ah, yes. The infamous, notorious Matt Walsh. Okay, so right off the bat, we're referring to someone who in bad faith made this documentary about trans people and how evil the trans people are, or at least the professionals who work day in and day out with trans people. So to use him as a source is very eye-opening. You can't be a woman if a woman is undefined. If you've ever heard anything about the documentary, at the end of the documentary, he asked, Matt Walsh asks his wife, what is a woman? And she answers, an adult human female. Now, I need help opening this jar. So right off the bat, not going off to a great ending. So, let's center ourselves on this term, adult human female. So again, it's using circular logic almost, because depends on what you define as female. And if you define female as someone who contains eggs, for instance, if you use that very narrow definition, you can run into certain problems. Now, I think as a modern society, we have come to the conclusion that, you know, there is nuance in these discussions, and every situation is going to call for a different verbiage or different terminology. Because, yeah, if you use the very strict definition of a woman or a female as someone who contains ovum or ova as their primary sexual reproductive organs, and has a vagina, and, you know, uses the very biological definition, and who has the karyotype of XY, you're going to run into a whole host of problems in these edge cases of, say, women who have androgen insensitivity syndrome, or AIS, because they do exist. And yes, essentially they are stereotypically male, but they live out their lives as female because they have insensitivity to androgen. So yeah, you have to make sure that you're considering these situations when it comes to coming up with these definitions. And the definition that was used in this situation, adult human female, is still, again, unsatisfactory. Now, I will posit to you this, that the answer that a lot of liberals and progressives have used, a woman is someone who identifies as a woman, is also circular logic. And I never said that there was a good definition. But if we're going to use the very narrowest definition of women, you would be excluding a lot of women, essentially. But yeah, let's go on.
Or dislike Matt Walsh if you wish, but the contradiction is clear. Liberal media and the woke require that we accept that a man can become a real woman.
Again, the term woke has become so overused in this day and age. And it's overused not by the left, but by the right. Woke, as a word, is a stand-in for anything that is typically anything that the right doesn't like, or anything that's inclusive. Let's be real here.
But when we ask what is a woman, it can't be defined. The contradiction is, how can someone actually be a woman if the word woman has no definition?
A woman is not anything in particular.
There is not one particular thing.
It could be many things to many people.
Some women have penises, right? Some men have vaginas.
There are cases where some words we use are intentionally undefined. For example, if you're someone who went to business school, or maybe you took a business course, you may be familiar with the term widget. Widget is used to refer to an anonymous product. You could say that a business produces 7 widgets and sells them for $10 a piece, with a profit margin of 50%. How much should it cost to produce the widgets? We could say that the business produced phones or pillows or barrels of oil, but for sake of solving the problem, it really doesn't matter. An anonymous product called a widget is perfect. But we don't need to anonymize gender or sex for the sake of something else, like a math problem. If we did, would woman be the word we choose? Of course not. Woman can't be undefined and defined at the same time. The word woman already has a pre-existing definition, which is to have a certain type of reproductive cells, specifically.
There we go. Using this very reductivist definition of women. I have problems with this, not necessarily because I don't fit this definition, but because my mom would not fit this definition. She got a double hysterectomy. And so by this definition, she's no longer a woman.
Eggs. The woke can't simply hijack a word that already has utility. We'll need to replace it with something else. Liberal media and the woke turn what should have been a civil discussion about including minorities into our culture into this volatile hatred towards anyone who disagrees with them. Feminism has been one of the loudest advocates for the transgender minority.
Yes or no, depends on who you ask. There are people called TERFs, trans exclusionary radical feminists, and they actually tend to have the loudest voice, unfortunately. We have one across the pond, billionaire, wrote a really popular children's fantasy series that has been in the news a whole lot lately. Who is not a friend of the transgender community. So again, you'd have to be very specific on which feminists you're referring to.
Miss Magazine, which is a US-based feminist publication, has a yearly list of top feminists. Multiple women on this list were added simply for being transgender. As an ideology, feminists aim to break the patriarchy and reinforce equality between men and women, often citing things like the gender pay gap or tearing down stereotypes. But trans people fight for the exact opposite. They want the stereotype.
Okay. This is the part where we definitely do not agree. Well, for one, he's making the mistake of speaking over people. Essentially, the trans people are fighting against these things. Depends on who you ask. He's painting in very, very broad brushstrokes here. The trans community is not one monolith, like a lot of conservatives like to believe. You know, we have anyone from Blair White and Buck Angel, I think. Blair White and Buck Angel, they're part of like the, I guess, the more conservative type of trans medicalists. And you can agree and disagree with them on their stances on, you know, whether you need dysphoria to be trans or not. And then the very, I guess, is new within the last 5 to 7 years of basically trying to be as inclusive as you can, trying to expand the umbrella of the trans community to include like non-binary people and ladyboys and tomboys, that sort of thing. And I I don't know, it's just, there's a lot of issues that I do have with both the trans medicalists and the radically inclusive people. And I don't have the time to get into the nitty-gritty. But yes, by and large, the trans community is not one thing. So you can say Blair White, for instance, yeah, she's fighting against feminists because she's upholding the gender binary, I suppose. God, like, back up your claims, dude. Back them up. It's a lot of issues.
You want the heels, the long-styled hair, and the dresses. These are two groups that could be fighting for more opposite goals, but yet feminist groups continue to celebrate trans victories. It seems very strange that feminist organizations like Miss Magazine, which fought for the eradication of female stereotypes like staying at home or their place is the kitchen, would accept these stereotypes when it comes to transgender. Feminist movements can't both support and not support female stereotypes at the same time.
Okay, so I will make a distinction. There is a difference between featuring stereotypes and including individuals who want to express, typically, a feminine presentation. There's a difference, and I don't think he is noticing this.
Now, I will say that unlike the 2021 list of top feminists, which had several trans women on it, the Miss Magazine 2022 list of top feminists has none. So it appears that the wokeness is starting to wake up to some of its logic fallacies. Employers and managers are encouraged to hire for diversity. At a minimum, we're asked to hire staff that reflects the diversity of the general population. For example, since 14% of the US population is Black, we're asked to have approximately that same percentage on staff. The reason for this is not only for affirmative action, but also because people from a variety of different backgrounds will often have a variety of different perspectives, which is true. However, once hired, employers and managers aren't allowed to ask this person what their perspective is as a Black person. It would be considered culturally insensitive to single out someone as a minority. So there appears to be a contradiction here. We're encouraged to hire minorities due to their unique perspective, but then be reprimanded for asking them what their unique perspective is.
This is like the second or third straw man that he's presented. Because I think people of the Black community, people of marginalized communities in general, can understand the difference between a good faith question about your experience and what might be considered a microaggression or microaggressive question like, where are you from? No, really, where are you from? So, I mean, yeah, you can have Black people on your staff and ask them, hey, as a Black person, what do you think? And most Black people would be like, oh yeah, no, here's what I think, blah, 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 blah. I don't think anybody has a problem with their input or opinion being asked. They might be mentally aware that they're probably like the token Black person or the token female or whoever. But I don't know, is tokenism a good or bad thing? I don't know.
Here's another contradiction on this one. In an interview, employers cannot ask an individual's religion, national origin, race, or disability. So how can you hire for diversity if you don't know who you're hiring? The only exception to this is if the trait is a bona fide occupational requirement. For example, if a Catholic church is hiring a priest, the individual should probably be Catholic. If a women's shelter is hiring staff, it's reasonable that they hire a woman. Otherwise, if employers can't prove that the trait is a bona fide occupational requirement, then they'd be in trouble if they asked about a candidate's religion, national origin, race, or disability. So the contradiction is that employers can't be asked to hire for diversity, but then also restricted from verifying diversity. How would you be able to ensure that you're indeed hiring the correct way? We're going to spend a couple minutes on this one.
I thought it said tranny as freedom. I was like, oh God.
Anyone drops the phrase fascism or tyranny, you gotta back it up. That's not something...
You've got to back up your claims.
So let's jump in. Feminists fought for equal rights and won. From these strong women came other movements, like homosexuality, which wanted sexual freedom.
Homosexuality as a... oh, God. LGBT movement, gays, lesbians, I don't know.
Was the removal of laws that made homosexuality illegal, and by removing the ban on same-sex marriage. Removing laws and creating freedom for oppressed individuals to express themselves is almost always a good thing. But we've gone over the top of this mountain.
Over the top of this mountain. Okay. Oh, God.
We're starting to come down the other side. We're now adding laws with the hope that this somehow creates freedom.
We are actually adding laws that takes away freedom. And it's by people from your side, Mr. Enlightened centrist. That's the most BS I've ever heard.
The US is in far better shape than Canada on this one, and probably will be forever due to the First Amendment, the freedom of speech. Canada has the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which also supports freedom of speech, but unlike the US, where you need 75% of the states to make a change to the Constitution, called ratification, the Canadian Parliament has the power to change the Charter of Rights and Freedoms and other acts, like the Canadian Human Rights Act, at its own discretion. The Canadian Senate is supposed to keep Parliament in check by researching, discussing, and recommending action for Parliament to take. But the Senate has no real power, which makes them a bunch of slouches collecting a paycheck. I don't say that lightly, or with any partisan agenda. The Canadian Senate really is just terrible. This is important because in 2017, Justin Trudeau modified the Canadian Human Rights Act so that for the first time in Canadian history, the government compelled speech, meaning that the government was telling you what to say, which is different from telling you what not to say. The US is in much better shape here, although there are some exceptions here as well, like true threats. But they're reasonable ones. In legal parlance, a true threat is a statement that is meant to frighten or intimidate. They constitute their own category of speech, like obscenities, child pornography, fighting words, and the advocacy of imminent lawless action. That is not protected by the First Amendment. The biggest difference between the US and Canada is the US compelled speech doctrine, which sets out the principle that the US government cannot force an individual or group to support certain expressions. Thus, the First Amendment not only limits the government from punishing an individual for their speech, it also prevents the government from punishing an individual for refusing to articulate, advocate, or adhere to the government's approved messages. This is a stark difference from compelled speech from Justin Trudeau and the Canadian government. This is how all this circles back to tyranny. Tyranny is an autocratic form of rule in which one individual exercises power without any legal restraint. In this case, the power is compelled speech, and Justin Trudeau has already implemented it without constraint. Back to the contradictions here. Tyranny is a type of oppression, in this case, speech. But we can't obtain freedom through means of oppression. Those are completely opposite principles. But maybe freedom isn't the goal anymore, and maybe we should have some civil discourse on what our countries want to strive for over the next century.
Civil discourse, yeah, we do need a lot more of that in this day and age.
Cultural appropriation is one that always seems to have many inconsistencies.
Exactly is cultural appropriation? Well, I'm glad you asked that question. Cultural appropriation is when someone takes elements from a culture not their own and remakes and reduces it into a meaningless pop cultural item. I'm thinking hipster headdresses, tribal face paint, and yes, those so-called Halloween harmless fun costumes. It's not harmless fun.
To marginalize a minority is to treat them as insignificant or peripheral. But I would argue that this is not the case in most accusations of cultural appropriation. In 2020, the Kansas City Chiefs withdrew their mascot in response to accusations of cultural appropriation. But is that cultural appropriation? Are they marginalizing Native American chiefs? It seems more like cultural appreciation. Sports teams
Yeah,
don't
so about this, cultural appropriation and sports teams changing their logos and their whole identity, essentially, because of some perceived grievance from community. So I think there are several cases of an irate minority of individuals, probably Native Americans, who have a stick up their behind over a freaking sports team appropriating their culture or whatever. But I think by and large, from the Native American community, I don't think that the typical Native American is going to care either way about these sorts of things. So for him to say that they are is just another straw man.
For teams after things that are marginalized, they use names that are badass with the goal of intimidating their opponents. They use a name that they would be proud to call themselves. A team wouldn't call themselves something inferior in hopes that it would intimidate their opponents. Those two things don't go together. We appropriate from everywhere. First from our parents, then from our friends, and then from our greater country. It's impossible to know the source of all our customs and traits that we inherit and adopt. Canada has 3 major cultures: Native Canadian, Quebecois, and the rest of Canada. The US has 2, Latin America and the rest of the US. To say that we don't absorb features from multiple cultures within our own country is nonsensical. To say that you have a culture is also to say that you've appropriated it from somewhere.
I don't think anyone is saying explicitly these things. Like, if you're having Mexican food, I don't think people are saying you're appropriating Mexican culture. Again, a straw man.
Not everywhere. If a man wants to dress up as a woman, who cares?
You do.
If a Westerner wants to wear an Aboriginal headdress or get a Japanese tattoo or open up a Chinese restaurant, who cares? You either agree that it's culturally inappropriate or you don't. But don't be inconsistent. If you're going to say that a sports team can't call themselves the Chiefs, then you must also believe that a white person can't practice yoga and vice versa.
Apparently, I've caused a boycott of a very large retail chain simply for being trans.
If this person put bronzer on their face and decided to identify as black, we would cancel Dylan in a hot minute. But when this person wears hot pants and talks about how